The sale was supposed to be quiet. That was the part that hurt the most, not the iron collar they pressed against her throat to mark her as property, not the cold mud beneath her bare feet in the courtyard of the Thornwall trade house, not even the crowd of strangers who looked at her the way men look at livestock at the autumn fair. It was the silence of her mother. Sarah had searched the crowd for Marin's face from the moment they led her out of the holding pen. She had told herself, over and over, through 3 days of darkness and cold water and the smell of other people's fear, that it was a mistake, that her mother would come, that the woman who had braided her hair every morning until Sarah was 12, who had pressed a copper bead into her palm for luck when she first shifted, who had called her my moonlight, my wolf, my heart, that woman would not sell her own daughter to settle a gambling debt. She had been wrong. The holding pen had given her 3 days to be wrong. 3 days of cold stone and the sound of other people crying and the particular mounting dread of a woman who still, even then, believed that love had a bottom, a floor beneath which it would not drop. She had clung to that belief the way you cling to a wall in deep water. It was the only thing keeping her head above the surface. Marin stood at the back of the crowd, half hidden behind a merchant's cart, watching with dry eyes as the auctioneer announced a starting price. Sarah didn't cry. She decided that in the first second her eyes found her mother's face. Whatever happened here today, she would not give this crowd the satisfaction of her tears. She would not beg, she would not flinch. She lifted her chin and stared straight ahead. The bidding began. She was 20 years old, unmated and Omega-ranked, the lowest possible standing in any wolf pack. Omegas were not considered warriors. They were not considered advisors or healers or anything of particular value. They were considered manageable, which was what the buyers around her were paying for. A docile pair of hands, a meek and quiet life force they could direct as they pleased. None of them knew what Sarah carried. She had kept the secret since she was 14. The silver fire that lived behind her sternum, that crawled up her arms when she was frightened or furious, that had once, just once, leapt from her fingertips and turned 3 inches of iron chain to ash. She had buried it deep, told no one. Her mother had seen it happen once and had never spoken of it again. Sarah had understood the message clearly enough. That kind of power in an Omega body was not a gift, it was a liability. The world was not built to accommodate Omegas who could burn things, so she had learned to be cold about it, methodical. She practiced in private, learned to feel the fire build and learned to press it down before it could show on her face or her hands or the temperature of the air around her. She had become very good at hiding, but it was still there. It had always been still there. It would fetch a much higher price. 20 silver marks, called a fat man in a green coat. 22, counted a woman with cold eyes and a buyer's ledger open in her hand. Sarah breathed slowly. In, out. She looked at the sky above the trade house roof. It was grey and heavy with the promise of rain. She fixed her attention there, on the clouds, and refused to look at her mother again. The bidding climbed. She was at 38 silver marks when the gates of the trade house courtyard opened, and the world went very, very still. She felt him before she saw him. That was the only way she could describe it afterward, a pressure change, like the air before a lightning strike, the kind of stillness that falls over a forest when something massive and patient moves through it. Every wolf in the courtyard went quiet. The auctioneer stopped mid-sentence. The woman with the ledger closed it with a snap. The man who walked through the gates was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, stupidly, as though height were the relevant detail, when a man walked with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once questioned whether a room belonged to him. He wore no crown. He didn't need one. King Cadron of the Northern Reach was 32 years old, unmarked, unmated, and by every account Sarah had ever heard, carved from the same cold stone as his kingdom's mountains. He had ruled for 9 years since his father's death. He had won 4 border wars and ended 2 more through sheer reputation alone. His pack numbered in the thousands. His wolves were the most feared fighters on the continent. He had not, to anyone's knowledge, ever attended a trade house auction. The journey from Caervethis to Thornwall was 9 hours by horse, and men like him did not make 9-hour journeys for unannounced errands. They sent intermediaries, they sent gold, they dispatched someone lower ranking to acquire whatever they needed, and then the item appeared in their possession as though it had always been there, without inconvenience or explanation. He had come himself. And he was looking at her. He crossed the courtyard without looking left or right, and his gaze, dark, flat, absolutely unreadable, settled on Sarah. She stared back. She didn't know why she did it. Every instinct she had, every social lesson beaten into her through 20 years of low-pack living, screamed at her to drop her eyes, to show submission, to make herself small and unthreatening and forgettable. She didn't move. Something shifted in his expression. So slight she might have imagined it. A fractional narrowing of his eyes, like a man reassessing a calculation. He turned to the auctioneer. "How much for the girl in the second pen?" It was not a question. The auctioneer stammered. "Your Majesty, the current bid is 38 silver. I'll give you 300 gold marks and we'll close this now." Absolute silence. 300 gold marks was more than the trade house turned over in a month. Sarah watched the auctioneer's calculations play visibly across his face. Watched the woman with the ledger close it for good and turn away. Watched the fat man in the green coat melt backward into the crowd. Watched her mother stand very still at the back of the courtyard, her expression unreadable, and then, quietly, disappear. The collar came off. A guard she didn't recognize fastened a cloak around her shoulders, heavy wool, the Northern Reaches dark blue, and she was guided toward the gate before the crowd had finished murmuring. She looked back once. The courtyard was already emptying. Her mother was gone. Sarah faced forward and walked. The king's travelling party was compact. 6 guards, 2 advisers, and a covered carriage that smelled of cedar and something medicinal she couldn't identify. No one explained anything to her. No one spoke to her at all until they were 2 hours north of Thornwall, and then it was only a guard telling her there was food in the carriage if she was hungry. She was, she realized distantly. She had not eaten in 2 days. She ate alone in the back of the carriage and watched the southern flatlands give way to the darker, older forests of the north, and tried to think clearly. The trees here were different from the ones she had grown up around, taller, older, with bark gone almost black from centuries of northern winters. They pressed close to the road on both sides, and in the occasional breaks between them she could see hills shouldering up toward a sky that had gone from grey to a deep, bruised purple as the light failed. She was moving further from everything she had known. That should have frightened her more than it did. The king had spent 300 gold marks to remove her from an auction. He had not explained himself. He had looked at her for approximately 4 seconds before making the decision, which meant either he knew something she didn't, or she had somehow impressed a man who, by all accounts, was not impressible. Neither option was entirely comforting. But she found, eating the bread and dried meat the guard had provided, that comforting was not actually what she needed. She needed information. She needed to understand the shape of her situation clearly enough to navigate it. She had survived 20 years of low-pack life through exactly this. Clear eyes, no illusions. Keep moving. She arrived at Caervethis, the seat of the Northern Reach, on the evening of the third day. The castle was exactly what she expected, enormous, grey, built for defence rather than beauty, perched above a lake so cold it smoked in the autumn air. It was not a place designed to make newcomers feel welcome. She was shown to a room on the third floor, clean, spare, adequately warm. A woman named Isolde, young, dark-eyed, and carefully not staring at Sarah's bare feet, brought a dinner tray and 2 changes of clothes and said, gently, "The king will see you in the morning." "Do you know why?" Sarah asked. Isolde hesitated. "No," she said, then quieter. "But he hasn't taken a meal in his great hall in 3 months. He rode 9 hours to that trade house. Whatever it is, it matters to him." She left before Sarah could ask anything else. The king's study was on the castle's 5th floor. Sarah counted the stairs on the way up, because counting things helped her think. She arrived at the door with 17 things she intended to ask, and 0 expectations about which of them he'd actually answer. He was standing at the window when she entered. Not sitting at his desk, not performing authority behind his title, standing, with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the lake below. And for one unguarded moment before he turned, he looked simply tired. Then he turned, and the tiredness was gone, replaced by that flat, careful blankness she was beginning to suspect was his default expression. "Sit," he said. "I'll stand if it's all the same to you." The flat look held for a second. Then, almost imperceptibly, something else. The ghost of something. He gestured toward the chair anyway, and went to his own seat behind the desk. "I need to explain your situation," he said. "Please." "You're here as a guest, not a prisoner, not a servant, not a purchased commodity. If you want to leave, I won't stop you." A pause. "But I'd ask you to hear me out before you decide." She sat down. "I'm listening." What he told her in measured, careful sentences was this. He was cursed, had been for 2 years. A slow, progressive freezing, not of his body, but of his ability to function as an alpha. His control over his pack bond was degrading. His wolf was retreating, growing distant, becoming inaccessible in the way that, in a king, was essentially a death sentence. His generals knew, his council did not. And if the council found out before he had found a solution, the power vacuum would fracture the Northern Reach in ways that border territories had been waiting to exploit for years. He had spent 2 years searching for a cure. Every healer, every seer, every witch who would take his gold had told him the same thing. The curse was tied to a living thread. Something, someone, whose power was the specific counter-resonance to the force that had bound him. The last seer he had consulted, a half-mad woman in a tower on the eastern coast, had given him a description and a location. An Omega girl with silver fire in her blood, who would be sold at Thornwall in the 3rd month of autumn. Sarah sat very still. "You want me to cure you," she said. "I want to find out if you can." He met her eyes steadily. "I won't force you. I won't pretend this is simple. I know what I'm asking. I know where I found you. I know that everything you've been told about yourself, about what you're worth and what you're capable of, has been calibrated to keep you manageable." She said nothing. "I think you've been lied to your entire life," he said. "I think you're something considerable, and I'd like to find out what." Outside, rain had begun to fall against the castle windows. Sarah thought about her mother's face, still and dry-eyed, watching, not coming. "I'll stay," she said, "for now." His expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders settled, almost imperceptibly, like a man who had been holding a breath for a very long time. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Sarah's life, and that was including the week she had been held in a trade house pen. She was given access to the castle's library, which was extensive, and to a practice room on the lower floor, where she began, cautiously, and then less cautiously, to let the silver fire out. It came more easily here. She didn't know if it was the northern air, or the latitude, or simply the fact that for the first time in her adult life, no one was watching her with fear and asking her to stop. The fire responded to the absence of fear the way a plant responds to sunlight, turning toward it, reaching, growing in directions she hadn't known it could grow. She could sustain it for longer. She could shape it with more precision. She could feel, somewhere beneath the burning, something larger and older than she had access to yet, waiting with the particular patience of something that had always known its time would come. Isolde became a fixed point. She brought meals, asked quiet questions, and seemed constitutionally incapable of treating Sarah as anything other than a person. On the fourth day, she introduced Sarah to the castle's herb garden with the solemn ceremony of someone bestowing a great gift. On the seventh day, she threatened a senior guard who had been rude in the corridor with a calm specificity that made Sarah deeply glad to have her as an ally. "How long have you worked here?" Sarah asked her once.
4 years, Isolde said. "It's since I was 16. She paused, setting out the dinner things with unhurried efficiency. "He's not what the stories say, you know, about the coldness. She seemed to choose her words carefully. "He's a man who learned that feeling things was dangerous and got very good at not doing it. Those aren't the same thing." Sarah thought about that for a long time afterward. The king she saw daily.
She hadn't expected that. He came to the practice room each morning to observe, never to interfere. He answered her questions about the curse in the same measured way he seemed to do everything, precisely without flourish, never giving more than what was asked. He was not warm. He was, she admitted to herself, occasionally something close to kind, in the way that a man is kind when he has forgotten he is capable of it, and the reflex surprises him. On the 12th day, she asked him what it felt like. He was quiet for a moment. "Cold," he said finally. "Like standing at a window in winter. You can see everything on the other side of the glass. You can remember what warmth felt like, but you can't reach it." She didn't have a response to that. So she said nothing, and he said nothing. And the silence was, she thought, almost comfortable. Almost. The first time her silver fire reached him, she didn't mean it. She had been practicing a controlled release, channeling the power through her hands in steady streams, the way one might control a tap rather than a flood. And she had misjudged. A tendril of light reached outward further than she intended, and it touched his hand where it rested on the wall beside her. He went very still. "Did that hurt?" she asked immediately. No. His voice was different. Something raw in it, stripped of its usual careful flatness. He looked at his hand, then at her. It felt like the glass broke. They both stood there in the aftermath of that sentence for a long moment. "It worked," she said. "It worked," he agreed. And for the first time, when his eyes met hers, the flat blankness wasn't there. In its place was something she didn't have a name for, though she felt it answer in her own chest, like a bell rung in an empty hall. They stayed in the practice room for another hour after that, neither of them quite able to return to the careful distance of before. She did not reach for him again. He did not ask her to. But there was a quality of attention between them that had shifted irrevocably, and both of them knew it. The thaw was not linear. She hadn't expected it to be. There were days when he retreated behind the flat blankness entirely, all business and strategic discussion and careful distance. There were days when she woke to find that the guards posted outside her room had doubled overnight, and she understood from Isolde's careful expression that there had been threats, and that the king had responded to them in his characteristically absolute manner. There was one evening, 3 weeks in, when she woke at the second hour of the night to the sound of pain, a low, barely audible sound from the room adjacent to hers, and she was through the door and kneeling beside his bed before she had entirely decided to move. The curse was spiking. She could see it in the way his jaw was clenched, in the sheen of cold sweat on his forehead, in the way his hands gripped the blanket with white-knuckled force. She didn't think about it. She pressed both her hands against his and let the silver fire flow. He exhaled. It took most of an hour before she was sure the spike had passed. By then she was sitting on the edge of his bed, cross-legged, his hands still held between hers, watching the lines of strain ease from his face with a satisfaction she didn't entirely know what to do with. He opened his eyes. "You should sleep," she said. "You should go back to your room." "Probably." She didn't move. He looked at her for a long moment. His hands didn't move either. "Why did you come?" "I heard you." Most people would have called a guard. Most people? She met his eyes. Were you one of those people before this, before the curse? The kind who would have called a guard? Something shifted in his face. Not the ghost of something this time. Actual movement. Actual change. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think I was." She stayed until he slept. She did not think about the way that felt, walking back to her own room in the dark, or the way his hands had tightened for just a fraction of a second before she let go. She thought about it later, which amounted to the same thing. Lord Wesson had been the king's chief adviser since before Kadrin had taken the throne. He was 60, silver-haired, possessed of an air of deep and permanent wisdom that Sarah found, the more she observed him, increasingly performed. He did not like her. He was too smooth to show it openly, but she had learned in 20 years as an Omega to read the things people chose not to say, and what Wesson chose not to say, loudly and consistently, was that she was a disruption, an unknown quantity, and a threat to whatever order he had spent 9 years carefully constructing. She caught him watching her twice in the great hall, not with open hostility, which she could have worked with, but with the quiet, patient watchfulness of a man cataloguing weaknesses. He was building something. She could feel it the way she could feel the fire building, a pressure, an accumulation, a sense of held breath before a force releases. She had not said anything to Kadrin yet, because she was still learning which of her instincts to trust, and which were the echoes of 20 years of low-pack living that told her to keep her head down, not to speak up, not to make herself more of a target than she already was. She should have spoken sooner. The first move against her was elegant. A rumour circulating through the castle staff, then the court, reaching Sarah's ears through Isolde, that the king was being manipulated by a southern girl who practiced forbidden magic and had used it to destabilize his judgment. The second move was less elegant. A woman arrived from the Western Territories, Lady Vane, highborn, beautiful, connected to 3 of the Reach's most powerful noble houses, She was presented at court as a prospective match for the king, and the presentation had Vessen's fingerprints all over it. The timing, the framing, the way the court was arranged, to signal that this was a resumption of normalcy, a course correction. Sarah watched Lady Vane watch the king across the great hall, and thought with a clarity that she recognized a moment too late as jealousy. She is part of it, not a rival, a piece on a board. She went to Cadrin that night and told him. He listened without expression until she finished. Then he said, "Vessen?" "I think so." "You're certain about the woman?" "No, but she arrived too quickly and was positioned too precisely. Someone briefed her." She paused. "She's not his end goal, though, and she's a distraction. Something to make the court focus on the question of your heir while he moves something else into place." He looked at her for a moment. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "See it, the shape of what's underneath." She thought about her mother, about every social calculation she had made from childhood just to survive, about the particular expertise developed by people who have no power and must therefore be very good at understanding those who do. "Practice," she said, "a lot of it." "Unwilling." He was quiet. Then, "I should have asked before now. What was done to you in the South before?" "It doesn't." "It does." His voice was quiet, not commanding. "It matters. You matter." She felt the words land somewhere central and didn't quite know what to do with them. So she looked at the fire in the grate and said carefully, "My mother sold me because I was inconvenient. She had a debt, and I was the largest asset she owned." A pause. "I spent a long time waiting for her to realize she'd made a mistake." "She didn't." He said nothing for a moment. When she looked at him, he was watching the fire too. "My father made a war decision that I disagreed with," he said. "When I was 17, I told him so. He told me that a king doesn't have the luxury of feeling things. That rule requires you to operate at a distance from yourself, from everyone." A pause. "He died 3 years later, and I had spent those 3 years learning to do exactly that. And then suddenly I was king, and I was very good at the distance, and I had never unlearned it." "You could," she said. He finally looked at her. "Could what?" "Unlearn it." The fire crackled between them. "I know," he said. His voice was low, stripped back to something she hadn't heard before. "I think that frightens me more than the curse." She didn't look away. "Join the club," she said. "We have matching symptoms." For one precise moment, something entirely unexpected happened. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile exactly, more the shadow of one, the memory that a smile was a thing his face could do. It disappeared almost instantly, but she had seen it. She filed it away and said nothing because some things were too fragile for comment. The trap came on a Tuesday. She should have seen it sooner. She had been distracted by the growing warmth between her and Cadrin, by the sessions in the practice room that had begun to feel less like work and more like conversation, by the way he had started to arrive 10 minutes early and leave 20 minutes late and not acknowledge either of these facts. Isolde came to her room in the early evening with the carefully neutral face she wore when she had bad news she was choosing how to frame. "Lady Vane has asked to see you. She says she has information about Lord Vessen. She wants to meet privately." Sarah's instinct said no. Her logic said she might be genuine. She might have realized she was a pawn. She might be trying to get out. She should have listened to her instinct. The meeting was in a lower courtyard she hadn't visited before, in a wing of the castle that predated the current structure by 2 centuries. Lady Vane was there, but she was not alone, and the look on her face was not the look of a woman offering information. It was the look of a woman who had been promised something in exchange for standing in a specific place. Vessen's guards came from 3 directions. Sarah burned through the first 2 chains they tried to put on her. The third was iron, soaked in something that dulled her senses. She recognized the medicinal smell from the carriage days ago and understood now what it was for. And she went down hard on the courtyard stones and thought distantly that she should have listened to her instincts. The king, Vessen said from somewhere above her, is not capable of choosing wisely right now. The curse has compromised him. You've accelerated it, actually. Whatever you've been doing has made his dependency on you pathological. He crouched down to her level, and his voice was almost gentle, the way knives are almost decorative. He'll recover once you're gone. He's a good king when he's thinking clearly. I've served him for 9 years, and I'll serve him for 20 more. This is not personal. You've been poisoning him, she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. The curse wasn't fate. It was you. A slight pause, long enough to confirm it. Where are you taking me? She asked. Somewhere quiet, somewhere that can't be traced back to Caer Vethis. He stood. You're resilient, I'll grant you that. Another girl would have broken at Thornwall. She thought, I didn't break. I bent. And now I know exactly how far I can bend. She had been saving it. She hadn't known she was saving it, hadn't consciously decided, but she understood, as the guards lifted her and began to carry her toward the east gate, that the silver fire had been building for hours, fed by fear and fury, and something else, something that had her mother's face and Kadrin's voice and the specific weight of being told, repeatedly, that she was not worth fighting for. She had always been worth fighting for. She let it go. Not a tendril, not a careful, controlled stream. All of it. The iron chain dissolved, the courtyard lit white silver, so bright she heard the guards cry out and shield their eyes. She felt the fire pass through her like a wave that had been building for a very long time from a very great distance and had finally found its shore. It was not painful. It was the opposite of painful. It was the relief of something long compressed, finally given room to expand, every secret she had kept since she was 14, burning itself clear in one long, brilliant exhale. She hit the ground on her feet and turned to face Vessen, and the expression on his face, finally, for the first time she had seen, stripped of its performed wisdom, was pure fear. Good, she thought. Let him understand now what it feels like to be the smallest person in the room. She heard running footsteps from the north corridor. She heard Kadrin's voice, low and carrying, saying, "Stand down," to someone she couldn't see. And then he was there, taking in the scene. The dazed guards, the scorched courtyard, Vessen backing against the wall, Sarah standing in the middle of it with light still crawling up her arms, and his expression went through several things very quickly before settling into something absolute. "Lord Vessen," he said, very quiet. Vessen tried to speak. "You poisoned me," Kadrin said, still quiet. The quiet that, Sarah had learned, was more dangerous than the loud version in most men. "You've been poisoning me for 2 years. You arranged her capture tonight to remove the one thing counteracting it." He paused. "How long were you planning to let it progress before you made your move?" Vessen's performed wisdom had evaporated entirely. What was underneath it was older and smaller and not admirable. "You were never going to be who your father was," he said. "You were never going to be what this kingdom needed."
I was going to be the hand behind the... Enough, Kadrin said. It was, Sarah thought. the most absolute single syllable she had ever heard spoken. The guards came then, real ones, his ones, and Wesson was taken without ceremony. Lady Vane, to her credit, was already gone. Someone, Sarah suspected, had helped her leave. There were things to deal with there, but not tonight. Tonight was just this. Cadrin, crossing the courtyard, stopping 3 feet from her, looking at her in the silver fading light with an expression she had never seen on him before. Open, unguarded, as raw as a wound, and not a thing like weakness. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." She looked at her hands. The fire was receding back under her skin, obedient now, satisfied. "Are you?" He reached out and took her hands, both of them. His grip was careful, not possessive, not desperate. The particular kind of careful that comes from someone trying not to reveal how much they want to hold on. "I rode through this castle looking for you," he said, "and I will tell you honestly that I have not felt anything that clearly in 2 years." She looked up at him. "I don't know how to do this properly," he said. "I was taught not to. I spent 9 years perfecting not to, and then you stood in a trade house courtyard and looked at me like I was nothing remarkable. And I thought—" He stopped, tried again. "I thought, there she is. I didn't know what I meant by it. I think I do now." She thought about 20 years of being manageable, about the copper bead and the braided hair, and the woman at the back of the crowd who hadn't come forward. About every person who had looked at her and calculated her cost rather than her worth.
She thought about 12 days of practice rooms and library access, and Isolde and the midnight hour when she had pressed her hands against his and felt something answer. "I know what you mean," she said. He kissed her then, in the scorched courtyard, in the receding silver light, with the kind of certainty that a man achieves when he has finally, after a very long time in the cold, stopped pretending he doesn't want to be warm. She kissed him back. Wesson's trial was public and thorough. The poison was documented, the conspiracy laid out before the full council in careful detail. The 2 years of deliberate sabotage made plain in evidence that Wesson had, ironically, kept meticulous records of in his private correspondence. He had been proud of it, apparently, had wanted it witnessed by posterity. He had his wish. The council witnessed it extensively. He was stripped of his titles and his lands and sentenced to exile in the Eastern Territories, which were cold and remote and had no political infrastructure to support his ambitions. Lady Vane returned to the West with a quiet agreement that her family's cooperation in the immediate aftermath of the scandal had been noted and would be remembered favourably. She left without rancour, which Sarah found, in retrospect, suggested she had been less enthusiastic about Wesson's plan than her participation in the courtyard had implied. Cadrin appointed a new chief adviser, a woman named Rail, who was 55 and had served in the Southern Court for 20 years, and had, Sarah discovered, been on his shortlist for the position for a very long time. Wesson had consistently found reasons to delay it. That, she thought, explained a great deal about Wesson's intelligence, if not his wisdom. The curse broke fully in the weeks after the courtyard. Not all at once. There was no single dramatic moment of chains falling away, no flash of light or thunderclap. It receded the way winter recedes, in increments marked by mornings when the frost was slightly less thick, afternoons when the light stayed a little longer. He smiled, properly, for the first time in the 3rd week of winter. It happened over dinner, over something Isolde had said. Isolde, who had been elevated to official household head in the aftermath of the conspiracy, and was handling the responsibility with the same calm efficiency she had always applied to everything. And the smile was so sudden and real, that for a moment the great hall went quiet with the surprise of it. Sera looked at him from across the table and felt the warmth of it like a hand pressed to her sternum. He looked back and said nothing, which said everything. The proposal was private. No ceremony, no audience. Just the two of them in the library at the end of a long day, surrounded by books and firelight, and the particular comfortable silence that had become its own kind of language between them. He said, "I want you to stay." She said, "I'm already here." He said, "I want you to stay formally, permanently, as my queen." She thought about it for exactly 4 seconds, not from uncertainty, but because she had always believed in thinking things clearly before committing to them, and this was a commitment she intended to keep. "Yes," she said. The wedding was in the first week of spring. The castle, which Sera had last seen in autumn grey and winter white, had undergone a startling transformation. Flowers from the kingdom's southern holdings, banners in silver and deep blue, the great hall lit with 200 candles against the long northern dusk. Isolde cried. She claimed fiercely that she was not crying, but the evidence was incontrovertible. Beta Daxon, the king's head general, who had spent the first 6 weeks of Sera's residence at Caer Vethis regarding her with the polite but unmistakable wariness of a man watching someone handle something fragile, stood at the front of the hall and watched her walk toward the king with an expression she recognized as hard-won respect, and inclined his head when she passed. She felt it land. She had earned it. Kadrin was waiting at the end of the hall in the formal dress of the Northern Reach, which was dark and precise and suited him exactly, and when she reached him he looked at her with the open, unguarded expression that had taken her months to see, and would, she thought, take the rest of her life to fully understand. "Ready?" she asked. "I've been ready," he said, "since a trade house courtyard in the 3rd month of autumn." She laughed. It surprised them both. They were married at dusk in the old tradition of the North, with fire and vows spoken aloud before the full court. When the sealing bond snapped into place, mate bond and pack bond and the silver thread of her power woven through his like a key in a lock, the candles in the great hall burned brighter for one single, sustained moment. The court fell silent in awe. Then the hall erupted into noise, and they were, for one mercy, simply 2 people standing close together in a room full of celebrating people, neither of them kings or omegas or cursed or sold or any of the things the world had tried to make them. She leaned close to him. "Are you warm?" she asked. He pressed his lips to her hair. "Yes," he said. "Finally." "Yes." 6 months later, she stood on the north tower of Caer Vethis and watched the summer come in over the lake. It was still cold. It was always still cold in the north, which she had made her peace with. But the cold had a different quality in summer, clean and bright rather than pressing. She could feel the pack bond humming steadily under her skin, familiar now, grounding. She could feel him 3 floors below in his study, working through a land dispute with the patience he had learned to extend toward things that used to frustrate him. She thought about Thornwall, the grey sky she had fixed her gaze on, the mud, the collar that had touched her throat for less than an hour before 300 gold marks made it irrelevant. She thought about her mother. She had not reached out, and her mother had not come. That wound had closed over, not cleanly, the way some wounds do, healing crooked but holding. But she was learning to live around the shape of it. She thought about the woman she had been in that courtyard, chin up, fire banked behind her sternum, refusing tears because some things you refuse on principle. Some forms of dignity you hold on to, not because they gain you anything, but because they are the last thing no one can take from you. She hadn't known, standing there, what was coming. She hadn't known about the man in the gate, or the castle on the cold lake, or the long unwinding of two people teaching each other what warmth was. She was glad she'd held on. She would always be glad she'd held on. Below her, she felt the pack bond pulse once. Warm, deliberate, a greeting between people who no longer needed words for the simplest things. She pressed her hand to her chest and sent it back, and over the cold northern lake, summer continued to come in, steady and unstoppable, the way all real warmth eventually does, and not with a crack of thunder, but with the slow and certain turning of the world toward light. Thank you for listening to this story today. These stories only exist because of you, and that is something I mean every single time. If this one landed for you, let me know in the comments. I read every one, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe. It is free, and it means these stories can keep going. Until next time.